No one saw the explosion coming. No warning, no time to run, just fire, steel, and silence. They said he died in the blast, buried beneath concrete and flame on the edge of the Arizona desert. But one creature didn't believe the silence, not for a second. 4 legs, amber eyes, and a loyalty deeper than orders. Echo waited. While men packed up their gear and lowered flags to half-mast, he stayed, nose pressed to rubble, ears twitching in the dry wind. Because somewhere under that ruin, Jack Mercer was still breathing. And sometimes, the only sound louder than death is a single whimper. This isn't just a survival story. This is a story about the bond they tried to bury and the heartbeat that refused to quit. Before we begin, listen closely. That sound? That's not the wind. That's Echo, still searching. The Arizona desert didn't just scorch it punished. By late afternoon, the outskirts of Mesa shimmered under a merciless July sun. Heat rose in waves from cracked pavement. The horizon trembled where abandoned warehouses stood like forgotten skeletons, silent and sullen. Wind carried the scent of scorched rubber and rusted steel, whipping through chain-link fences that buzzed under the weight of heat and secrets. It was the kind of place people forgot until something exploded, and something was about to. Inside a matte black armored van barreling along a dusty service road, Sergeant Jack Mercer sat, silent, brooding, watching the landscape pass through a slit of window. Jack was 38, tall and thick-built, with the calm of a man who had seen death blink first. His face was all hard lines and quiet memory sand-chapped skin, a jawline square enough to strike matches on, and dark brown eyes too old for his age. His military-cut hair showed threads of gray above the ears, and a scar arced from beneath his left ear to disappear into the collar of his body armor. A curved memory from a night in Kandahar when half his unit didn't come home. He rarely spoke unless necessary. When he did, his voice was gravel and steel. Even in silence, his presence gave others pause. Pain didn't make him bitter. It made him focused. Nestled at his feet was Echo, a 4-year-old German shepherd with black and tan fur dulled by sun and grit. Echo's ears perked with each bump in the road, his amber eyes scanning the door as if he knew the rhythm of death when it came knocking. Muscular, lean, with a single white blaze along his nose that gave him a permanent look of concern, Echo had served in over a dozen high-risk missions alongside Jack. To most, he was a tool. To Jack, he was the only one who never lied, never failed, never left. Family in a world where that word had lost its shape. Across from Jack sat Corporal Miguel Miggs Santiago, 29, the team's breacher. Slimmer than most, with a wiry build and a restless knee that bounced non-stop, Miggs had a nervous energy that annoyed and reassured in equal measure. His olive skin gleamed with sweat, and a faded tattoo of his sister's initials peeked from under his sleeve. He joked to hide how much he cared. His mouth never stayed shut long, but today, even he was quiet. Sergeant Ava Brooks sat beside him, her expression unreadable. In her early 30s, Brooks had a fierce grace to her dark skin, high cheekbones, a long French braid tucked into the back of her helmet. Calm, tactical, brutal when necessary. The only member of the team who had once outrun Jack in a desert sprint. Her eyes flicked between Echo and the briefing tablet in her lap. The mission was straightforward on paper. A suspected weapons cache hidden inside Warehouse Delta 9, part of a decommissioned industrial compound once owned by a shell company that vanished after a federal audit. Intelligence suggested modified explosives and potential cartel connections. The kind of mission the SWAT unit was built for. But Jack felt it. A hitch in his gut. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt planned. ETA 2 minutes, called out Lieutenant Reese Monroe from the front cabin. At 42, Monroe was broad-shouldered and perpetually sunburned, with a booming voice and a habit of chewing toothpicks like they owed him money. He was loyal to a fault and had a temper that only Jack could temper. Today, even Reese was quieter than usual. Jack reached into his vest and touched the folded piece of paper tucked near his chest. A letter, the ink smeared slightly by sweat, handwritten in looping 12-year-old script. His sister Lucy, now 14, back in Ohio. After their mother's death last winter, she'd moved in with their grandmother. The letter had come yesterday, filled with updates about middle school, a new cat, and a line that hit him harder than any bullet. "When you come back, can we just be a family again?" He hadn't replied yet. The van came to a halt, brakes hissing. Doors opened with a metallic slam. Sunlight poured in like a furnace. The warehouse loomed 50 meters ahead, concrete and shadow, a hollow building with broken windows and secrets older than Echo's training. The team fanned out. Echo moved with controlled power beside Jack, ears twitching, nose high, reading the air. They approached the side entrance steel door, slightly ajar. Miggs moved up, tools ready. Jack gave the silent nod. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of dust and rot. Shafts of sunlight sliced through broken panels above, spotlighting piles of rusted machinery, torn tarps, and old crates. Echo stopped. His body froze rigid, tail locked, nose quivering. "Something's off," Jack murmured. Brooks raised her weapon. "I see it. Movement rear corridor, 10 meters. They moved in formation, silent, swift. Echo gave a low, vibrating growl. Then the floor ruptured beneath them. A roar swallowed the air. Light became fire. Steel became shrapnel. And then nothing but dust and silence. Mesa woke to sirens that morning, but only the desert answered. What had once been a scorched stillness now hummed with tension. Helicopter blades thrumming above, rescue crews scattered like ants around a smoking ruin, and the sharp, bitter scent of ash riding the wind like a ghost refusing to be forgotten. The sky, once a clear blue canvas, was now a hazy bruise smeared with smoke and sunlight. Broken steel beams jutted from the rubble like bones clawing from the earth. The explosion had left a crater where Warehouse Delta 9 used to stand, and buried beneath it, the world assumed, was Sergeant Jack Mercer. The support team arrived just after sunrise. Dust clung to everything: boots, gear, lungs. Captain Nathan Hoyle, 45, led the operation now. He was a tall man with the broad shoulders of a football player gone slightly to seed, the years folding into deep grooves around his eyes. His once blonde hair had surrendered to gray, and his uniform was too crisp for the chaos surrounding him. Hoyle had been SWAT since '99, and nothing startled him anymore. Not blood, not wreckage, not even the thought of sending letters home. But today, he kept rubbing his temple, as if something deeper than noise gnawed at him. He watched the excavation with a clenched jaw, whispering updates into a handheld radio, his voice even but low. "We've recovered 2 bodies, Brooks and Santiago." Mercer's transponder last pinged beneath Sector 4. No signal now. On the other side of the rubble, near the southeast corner where the loading bay had collapsed into itself, a different kind of chaos stirred. Echo, covered in soot, his left hind leg bleeding from a deep gash, was resisting containment. 2 handlers from the K9 support unit had managed to secure a lead around his vest, but he fought them with every ounce of muscle in his trained body. One of the handlers, Private Darnell Reese, 26, lanky with freckled skin and the kind of awkward posture that came from growing too fast in high school, was sweating bullets as he tried to calm the dog. "Jesus, this one's strong, he won't back down," he muttered. The other, Corporal Linda Halverson, 33, stocky with short dark curls and steady hands, leaned down and tried to soothe him. But Echo's eyes never left the wreckage. He was pulling toward it, nose twitching, body low and ears forward. Not in fear, but in a silent insistence. His growl was deep, constant, almost like mourning. They finally loaded Echo onto the K9 transport vehicle, a modified armored van designed for K9 triage. Inside was Staff Sergeant Mira Caldwell, 39, a veterinary officer with the Air Force, assigned temporarily to the SWAT unit. Mira had the unshakable calm of someone who had seen dogs stitched back together in both Afghanistan and Appalachia. She had copper skin, tight braids pinned back, and eyes that rarely blinked unless something truly unsettled her. As Echo was lifted into her care, she immediately noticed something off, not just the physical wounds, which were treatable, but the tension. The dog's heart rate spiked with proximity to the blast site, and when she tried to listen to his breathing with her stethoscope, he shuddered violently. "He's in full-on distress," she told Reese. "Classic signs of acute operational stress. This isn't just adrenaline. He's lost his bond." Echo refused food, refused water, refused sedation. His body lay still, but his eyes, those amber sentinels, locked onto the steel doors, as if waiting for them to open. Mira reviewed his records, noting the detail others had missed. Echo had been assigned to Jack exclusively for 3 years. No other handler, no other home. This wasn't just grief. It was disorientation, identity collapse. Without Jack, Echo didn't know where to be, or why. Back at the site, the rescue drones hovered silently, scanning heat signatures through layers of cement and steel. There was nothing. Captain Hoyle stood near the smoldering edge of Sector 4, helmet in hand, watching as soldiers placed 2 flag-draped bags into transport stretchers. A younger lieutenant approached. Second Lieutenant Trevor Marks, 24, fresh from West Point, skin pale under his dusty gear, hands trembling slightly as he handed Hoyle a tablet. "Sir, memorial arrangements are being requested. The Colonel recommends Sergeant Mercer be listed as KIA and awarded the Medal of Valor posthumously. Paperwork is prepped, just needs confirmation." Hoyle didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to the wreckage. "Not yet," he muttered. "No body, no ceremony." The lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, with respect, nobody could have survived that blast." Hoyle finally turned. His voice was quiet but unflinching. "Mercer's the kind of man you don't bury until you hear his last breath. Not before." Meanwhile, miles away, inside a temporary K-9 recovery center north of the city, Echo lay on a thermal mat. The hum of medical equipment filled the air, but he didn't move. Mira sat beside him, charting vitals, when something caught her attention. A sound, not loud, not sharp, just a faint, breathy sound that didn't belong. A whisper from a place no one should have survived. Echo twitched, his head lifted, his ears flicked once, then again. And then, slowly, he stood, favoring his back leg but standing with certainty. Mira leaned forward. "What is it, boy?" she asked. But Echo wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the reinforced door again, tail low, body tight. He barked, once, sharp, focused. Far below the ruin of Warehouse Delta 9, buried beneath layers of cinder block and silence, a broken voice barely formed a name. Echo. The desert never truly slept, especially not in midsummer. Even at midnight, the heat clung to the ground like breath held too long. The stars above Mesa burned white and sharp against a bruised sky, indifferent to the wreckage beneath them. The warehouse ruins had cooled from flame, but not from memory. Somewhere amid the rubble, metal still groaned softly under its own weight. The city, 10 miles out, slept unaware. But out here on the fringe between forgotten land and federal grid, something stirred. Echo lay in his recovery kennel, breathing shallowly, body coiled but not at rest. The canine ward was quiet, filled with the low mechanical hum of fans, medical monitors, and an occasional bark from another dog recovering from a bomb sweep gone wrong. The metal walls carried sound too far, and light not far enough. Echo's eyes, golden and wide, were fixed on the exit. His left hind leg had been bandaged earlier that day, stitched and wrapped by Staff Sergeant Mira Caldwell, but his body language spoke not of pain, but of mission. For the past 6 hours he had refused sedatives. Mira, despite all her experience, had noted it in her report with a single line: "He's waiting for someone we've already buried." Now, in the creeping stillness of 2:08 a.m., Mira slept in her small cot in the office behind the triage unit, unaware that Echo had not slept at all. The latch on his kennel, meant to hold even the strongest K9 under stress, hadn't accounted for Echo's teeth. Jack had taught him during their first deployment how to manipulate the spring back. Then it was just a trick to impress the other handlers. Tonight, it was survival. Echo nudged the latch with his jaw, released the spring, and slipped out with an agility that defied his wound. His gait was uneven but steady, muscles pulling against pain with purpose. He moved through the corridor like a ghost, the pads of his feet silent on the vinyl floor. Outside, the gate separating the facility from the main road was closed, but the fencing along the east side, behind the equipment yard, had a breach left from a storm months ago. One Mira had noted for maintenance, but paperwork moved slower than instinct. Echo slipped through the torn wire, the edge slicing a new scratch along his flank. He didn't flinch. The scent was calling. The memory of fire and blood and Jack's voice caught mid-command. It clung to his mind like burrs to his coat. The route back to the warehouse took just under 2 hours by paw. He moved through mesquite thickets, past tumbleweeds frozen mid-spin by the still air, past coyotes that watched from a distance but didn't follow. His paw prints dotted the edge of the service road, marked faintly in red. The warehouse appeared on the horizon like a sleeping monster-collapsed ribs rising from the ground, lights from perimeter patrols flickering at its edges. No one saw Echo approach. No one had reason to expect him. The security team, led by Sergeant Pete Monroe, 42, bald with a hawk nose and a deep distrust of both animals and journalists, had posted 2 guards near the north entrance. They were chatting over thermoses of burnt coffee and watching a moth bounce off a portable floodlight. Echo didn't go through them. He slunk around the far side, past the yellow tape, into the zone marked unstable. He sniffed, then paused, then lowered his head and began to track. The scent was faint but deep earth, blood, sweat, and something older, fear. Not panic, but the kind Jack carried like an extra layer under his skin. Echo had followed it through alleys in Aleppo, through train yards in Munich, through fields soaked in night and cordite. His paws padded through the broken concrete until he stopped at a slope of collapsed rebar and brick. The corner had been written off in the initial sweep, too unstable, they'd said. No heat signatures, no noise. Dead zone. But Echo felt it like gravity. He began to dig. At first it was quiet, then faster. Claws struck cement. Dirt sprayed behind him in small bursts. His breath was sharp, guttural, ears twitching with every vibration. After 10 minutes, his paws were bleeding again. He dug, anyway. He let out a low howl not loud enough to draw attention, but full of something raw and primal. A call not just to Jack, but to something deeper, the bond they shared. The bond that had once pulled Jack out of a minefield in Syria when Echo had sensed the wire under their boots. He remembered. It had been nearly 3 years ago, in a village west of Homs, during a dawn raid gone wrong. The wind had shifted, and Echo had caught the scent seconds before the pressure plate. Jack had turned to yell at his men, and Echo had launched, knocking him flat just as the device clicked. The explosion took half the wall, left shrapnel in Echo's side for weeks. But Jack lived. Afterward, Jack never said thank you. He just sat with Echo every night until he could walk again. From that moment, they were more than handler and dog. They were survivors. Now, as the moon crept higher, Echo clawed at the collapsed edge of Sector 4, tearing into the silence. And then his ears shot forward. A sound, not a groan, not metal, a voice. So faint it could have been wind. But Echo froze, head cocked, then whined sharply. Buried beneath the rubble, Jack Mercer lay barely conscious. One leg twisted under a slab of wall. His ribs ached. Dust clogged his throat. Every breath tasted like rust. His radio had long died. His voice had too, until now. But something had pulled him awake. A sound in the dark. A noise not of machines, but of memory. He turned his head slightly, forcing out a name that felt more instinct than thought. Echo. And above, Echo howled again. A deep, rising cry that cut through cement, through doubt, through miles of grief. Then he barked. Once, twice. And this time, someone heard. Mesa's early morning wind carried the chill of forgotten things, ash, regret, and something more primal. The stars had begun to fade, giving way to the dullest hint of sunrise, a bruised lavender smeared across the desert horizon. The ground was still warm from yesterday's sun, the air thick with dust unsettled by machines that had been working non-stop for days. Warehouse Delta 9 stood like a wound trying to scab over cauterized steel, rebar curled like fingers, walls collapsed inward. Floodlights still pierced the haze, casting long, broken shadows across cracked asphalt. The site was quiet again, almost abandoned for the night, except for two figures patrolling the northern boundary. Private Jensen Kim was only 20, barely through basic, lean and tall with skin the tone of cinnamon and a jaw that still hadn't fully shed its baby smoothness. His eyes flicked nervously between every movement, the kind of soldier still waiting for his first real mistake. Next to him, Sergeant Malachi Rowe, pushing 40 with a linebacker build. A thick mustache and a neck like a power pole, was chewing tobacco and barely acknowledging Kim's presence. Rowe had seen everything twice and had learned the hard way not to chase every noise in the dark. That was until they heard the dog. A single bark, then another, then a howl, low, guttural, and echoing between broken concrete like the call of something primal and grieving. Rowe froze mid-chew. "You hear that?" he asked, voice suddenly sober. Kim was already lifting his flashlight. "That's a K9. That's a K9 alerting." By the time they reached the southwest quadrant, they found him, Echo, bloodied, paw pads raw, standing over a mound of broken brick and twisted metal, his body rigid with purpose. He barked again, sharp and deliberate, then turned to dig. Rowe's eyebrows shot up. "That's Mercer's dog. That's Echo." Kim's face went pale. "But Mercer's—" Rowe didn't let him finish. He grabbed his comm. "Command, this is Patrol Team 2. We've got a live K9 alert Sector 4. Dog is active. Possible live contact." The radio hissed back almost instantly. "Stand by. QRF inbound." 10 minutes later, the scene turned electric. Rescue crews poured into the zone, headlamps cutting across the dust like beacons. The Rapid Response Unit was led by Sergeant Dana O'Connell, 36, compact and muscular with short red hair and freckled skin streaked with sweat and dust. Her green eyes scanned the chaos as she barked orders like a general on caffeine. She had earned her stripes in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and didn't waste time on ceremony. "I want thermal scopes sweeping this whole quadrant. Get the concrete saws. You flag that dog's position. He knows something." While the rescue team began the work of clearing debris, Echo refused to be moved. He stood close, only shifting when the rubble was too unstable for his weight. One of the team medics, Corporal Jamal Reed, a soft-voiced giant with mahogany skin and fingers thick from years of stitching battlefield wounds, approached to check the dog's injuries, but Echo growled low and refused to leave. Reed backed off, shaking his head. "He's not going to leave until Jack's out. That's not just a dog. That's a damn brother." They worked quickly. Thermal imaging revealed a faint heat signature under nearly 6 feet of debris. Jack was there, alive. Time blurred into adrenaline. Dana O'Connell organized shifts. A backhoe was brought in to lift the larger slabs, but the final stretch had to be dug by hand. Rebar-cut gloves, dust-clogged lungs, blood and sweat soaked through shirts. After 45 minutes, a shout cut through the air. "Contact! We've got him!" Jack Mercer's body was found curled beneath a collapsed beam, half buried in broken plaster and shattered brick. His left leg was twisted unnaturally beneath him, likely broken in at least 2 places. His right arm was pinned, and blood had crusted in a jagged line along his temple. but he was breathing, faint, labored, but alive. Echo let out a single, almost human sound, a whine that rose into a breathless exhale. He pushed forward as the medics moved in, refusing to stay behind. Reed helped clear a path, and Echo slid up beside Jack just as they began stabilizing his vitals. He lay down next to the stretcher, pressing his body against Jack's side. Jack stirred. His eyes fluttered. "Echo," he rasped. The team fell silent for a heartbeat. Then everything moved at once. IV splints, calls for medevac. Within 10 minutes, a helicopter roared in from the north, its blades scattering dust in circles like some violent angel descending from heaven. Jack was lifted onto the stretcher. Echo rose to follow, but his body betrayed him. He staggered, then collapsed beside the landing pad. Mira Caldwell, just arriving in the second wave of response, sprinted to him. Her face was tight with exhaustion. Her uniform rumpled, stethoscope half forgotten around her neck. She dropped to her knees and checked his pulse. "He's dehydrated, overheated, bleeding from the pads. He pushed too far." She looked up at Dana, who was on the radio coordinating extraction. "We're bringing the dog, too." "He's stable?" Dana asked, not breaking stride. "He's earned the ride," Mira replied. "If he's going out with Jack." They lifted Echo onto a second stretcher, laying him beside Jack as both were secured into the helicopter. As the rotor blades kicked up a storm of dust, Echo's eyes cracked open just enough to find Jack's face across from his. And even as the medic adjusted the IV, Echo's gaze never shifted. He watched Jack until both were swallowed by the sky. Back at the command tent, Private Jensen Kim reviewed the footage from Roe's helmet cam. It had caught everything from Echo's first bark to the moment Jack called his name. He uploaded it to the internal server under the heading K9 Recovery Footage, Sector 4. Within hours, it had already been shared between SWAT divisions across 3 states. By noon, someone had added a title, Ghost Dog, the one who wouldn't leave. San Diego's military medical complex sat nestled in the fog-tinged hills, its white walls gleaming faintly in the morning sun, like polished bone. The ocean breeze carried salt through the hospital courtyards, stirring the small flags planted beside garden paths where wounded soldiers sometimes walked when their bodies remembered how. Summer had softened into September, but the air still held warmth, dry and clear, an odd comfort to those whose pain could not be touched by sunlight. Inside room 214 of the specialized trauma wing, the beeping of monitors, the hum of oxygen lines, and the low shuffle of nurses filled the sterile calm. Sergeant Jack Mercer lay motionless beneath layers of gauze and pressure dressings. His right leg was immobilized in a traction rig, metal pins gleaming against pale, scar-mapped skin. His chest rose with effort, not just from the trauma of 3 surgeries, but from the weight of memory. His face was more hollow now, the angular cheekbones sharper against his weathered skin. Purple shadows darkened beneath closed eyes, but his jaw remained tense, even in sleep like a man still bracing for impact. He hadn't spoken since the last operation. Not a word, but he had whispered one name. Echo. Across from his bed, Echo lay curled on a thick military-grade foam mat, bandages wrapped around his forelimb and shoulder. His breathing was shallow, one ear twitching whenever the door creaked. The staff had argued at first dogs were not permitted in this wing, especially not in rooms designated for intensive recovery. But Dr. Laurel Kendrick had made an exception. Laurel, 42, was the lead trauma psychologist on base. Tall, with deep brown skin, tight curls pulled into a low bun, and oval glasses that magnified her gentle, assessing gaze. She had grown up in a military family and joined the Army Medical Corps after losing her brother to suicide post-deployment. She understood that sometimes survival meant breaking the rules. "This dog isn't a pet," she told the committee. "He's his tether." Now every morning at 6:45 a.m., Laurel entered room 214 and sat across from Jack. Most mornings Jack didn't respond, but Echo did. When Jack twitched in his nightmares, Echo would rise and place his head beside the mattress, When Jack flinched at the beep of a machine, Echo would whine low, grounding him. The dog didn't bark anymore. He didn't need to. Laurel had seen it only a few times in her career, the kind of bond forged in silence, in fire, in rubble. Echo didn't just remind Jack of who he was, he reminded him that he was still here. Jack's physical therapy began slowly. 2 weeks after the third surgery, he was wheeled out into the courtyard under a nurse's supervision. He was quieter than most. The only time his eyes flickered with intent was when Echo limped alongside him. Every step the dog took seemed to pull Jack forward. Not because he was leading, because he was enduring. One morning, after another silent hour in the courtyard, Laurel finally broke the barrier. "You lost more than blood out there, didn't you?" Jack didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. So she continued. "You ever talk about your family, Sergeant?" Jack's voice, when it finally emerged, was raspy and raw. "My sister, Liz, raised me after the wreck." Laurel nodded. "Car accident?" Jack blinked slowly. "Drunk driver. I was 6. She was 17. We had no one." "And the Army?" Jack looked toward Echo before answering. "I needed something to belong to, something that needed me back." Laurel scribbled nothing, just listened. He continued, slower this time. "When Liz went off to college, I enlisted. Infantry. I thought maybe if I gave myself rules, I wouldn't fall apart." "You think you fell apart?" He didn't answer, but his silence wasn't empty. It was full. Echo shifted beside him. Jack reached out, resting a weak hand on the dog's head. "He never let me go," Jack whispered, "even when everyone else did." That night, Jack woke screaming. The tremors shook the rails of his hospital bed. Nurses rushed in, trying to pin his flailing arms without reopening stitches. Echo surged up and jumped onto the bed uninvited, planting his front paws on Jack's chest and locking eyes with him. It stopped the screams. Jack panted, sweat-soaked and wild-eyed, but Echo's steady gaze pulled him back. Laurel, who had been called to observe, stood at the door and watched in awe. The next morning, Laurel introduced something new, exposure recall therapy. She sat across from Jack with a clipboard, gently guiding him through controlled memory surfacing. Echo sat between them. Jack spoke haltingly about the mission. The moment he realized the roof was collapsing, the pain, the stillness. Then about the voice he heard in the dark. Not God, not his sister. "It was Echo," he said. "I didn't even know if I was awake, but I kept hearing his whimper. That's what pulled me back." Outside the hospital walls, the footage of Echo's discovery had spread like wildfire through military forums and veteran communities. Soldiers who'd served with K-9 units shared their own tales of loyalty. A former Marine commented, "That's not a ghost dog, that's a guardian." A wounded Air Force pilot wrote, "That animal didn't just dig through rubble, he dug through death." And Echo remained in room 214 every night, every therapy session, every long silence. One evening, Jack was visited by a woman with weathered hands and a shawl that smelled faintly of cinnamon. Liz Mercer, now 47, had soft streaks of gray in her black hair and tired eyes behind square glasses. She was Jack's sister, the one who had carried him through grief and then let him go to find something solid. She hugged him, hard. Then she hugged Echo. "He remembers you," Jack said, voice hoarse. "I never forgot him," Liz whispered. They sat in silence as Echo dozed at Jack's feet. Liz looked at her brother, scarred, limping, but alive, and smiled. "You know," she said softly, "you've always had this thing for impossible rescues." Jack reached down and scratched Echo behind the ear. "He's the one who rescued me." The fall air in Arlington, Virginia, carried a different weight, crisp, calculated, political. Far from the sand-worn edges of Arizona and the quiet wards of San Diego, this was the heart of military machinery. Trees lining the Pentagon parking lot were turning ochre and red, but inside the granite-colored walls of the Joint Task Intelligence Command, the atmosphere was far from seasonal. It was clinical, tense, buzzing with a kind of urgency only secrets could sustain. Sergeant Jack Mercer, now walking with a reinforced brace along his leg, entered through a side elevator with Lieutenant Ana Reyes beside him. Ana, 34, was a sharp-featured Latina with short black hair and a deep scar over her left eyebrow, a leftover from an operation in Bogota that nearly ended her career. She had the kind of posture that came from 10 years of doing everything the hard way, and a voice like gravel and steel wrapped in velvet. She was the kind of officer who didn't waste time with pleasantries, but remembered every soldier's name and the name of their kids. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as they walked. "You don't have to relive the whole thing." Jack nodded. "They need a witness. I'm the only one left who heard the voice on that channel." He hadn't worn a uniform since the explosion, but today he wore the insignia again, not for ceremony, but because betrayal deserved confrontation. Inside the debriefing room, dimly lit and lined with soundproofing panels, 4 people were already seated. There was Colonel Mason Rhodes, a towering man in his mid-50s with weathered skin like tanned leather, a gray mustache like gunmetal, and a demeanor carved from old-school discipline. Across from him sat Lieutenant Commander Priya Shah, a cyber operations lead with warm brown skin, a buzz cut, and tattoos in Sanskrit along her forearms. She was quiet but razor-sharp, with eyes that missed nothing. As Jack entered, Shah looked up from her tablet. "Welcome, Sergeant Mercer. Take your time. We're not here for formality. We're here for truth." Jack sat. Ana stood behind him, silent backup. Shah began. "We've analyzed all black box comms data from Operation Sierra Fire. Most of it's corrupted due to the explosion, but we pulled enough. What we found confirmed our suspicion. Your team's encrypted location ping was redirected from an internal IP, not an outside breach. This was someone feeding your location to the enemy." Colonel Rhodes added, "We need you to tell us everything you remember, especially about the voice transmission just before the detonation." Jack's fingers clenched the table edge. It was male, calm, no panic. He used our internal call codes, exact ones we had reviewed just that morning. Someone who had clearance. He paused, eyes narrowing. Then he said, "They'll be in position in 5 minutes. We need a flash distraction." Shah nodded. "And then?" Silence. 30 seconds later, the building exploded. A quiet fell over the room like a dropped curtain. Ana stepped forward. Based on the phrase and ping triangulation, we cross-referenced voice samples from every SWAT tech operator, handler, and logistics officer with access to that code set. Rhodes finished her sentence. "We have a match." A file slid across the table. Jack opened it. His brow tightened. Staff Sergeant Ellis Thorne. Thorne had been a logistics coordinator for 5 years, unremarkable on paper average build, sandy blonde hair, forgettable blue eyes, the kind of face that disappeared in a crowd. But Jack remembered him. Thorne had always been overly friendly, always where he didn't need to be, asking too many questions about routes, timing, comms. Jack had dismissed it as harmless until now. "He was at briefing that morning," Jack said. "He sat behind Echo's kennel near the tech console." Shah confirmed. "We believe he was paid off by the Gerardo cartel. We've tracked deposits through a ghost account connected to Panama. He sold out your team for $100,000. Jack leaned back, blood cold. "He killed them all for a payday." "And he almost killed you," Rhodes added grimly. They showed him the arrest footage, Thorne, in civilian clothes, wide-eyed and silent, as MPs cuffed him outside a cafe near Quantico. He didn't resist, just muttered something no one could hear. Jack watched the screen go black. "What happens next?" Rhodes said simply. "Justice. Quietly. Thoroughly. No medals for this one. Just a closed door and a long sentence." Jack exhaled. It wasn't peace, but it was weightlifting. Meanwhile, 2 floors down in the Pentagon's new K-9 Integration Division, Echo stood beside a different kind of battlefield. He was now the centerpiece of a new recovery program, a pioneering pilot designed to pair retired working dogs with veterans suffering from PTSD. His handler for the day was Corporal Devin Price, a 29-year-old former Army sniper with pale skin, messy ginger hair, and a prosthetic below his left knee. Devin had lost his partner to an IED in Afghanistan and hadn't spoken more than 3 words to any therapist in the past year. But when Echo walked in, confident, calm, amber eyes locking onto Devin without judgment, something cracked open. They sat together in silence for 20 minutes. No commands, no forced conversations, just breath and presence. By the end of the hour, Devin had placed one trembling hand on Echo's back. I remember this, he whispered. It feels like something real. Echo leaned into him. Later, an article circulated through the Defense Health Agency's internal newsletter. Its title read, "Healing Without Words, the Dog Who Came Back from Fire." Echo's photo ears alert, muzzle graying, eyes steady stood above the tagline. Loyalty didn't die in the blast. It came back stronger. Jack saw the article printed and pinned to the hospital common room board. He walked over slowly, leaning on his cane. Beneath the photo, he scribbled one word on a sticky note. Brother. Snow had begun to fall over Estes Park, Colorado, the way memories sometimes return, quiet, soft, insistent. The mountain town, nestled against the jagged edge of the Rockies, lay hushed under a blanket of early winter. Pine trees stood frozen in place like green sentinels, while icy wind curled down the slopes and rattled the chimneys of log homes below. The cold was clean, almost holy, something that scraped the old world off your skin and asked who you were now. Jack Mercer stood at the edge of the field behind his cabin, his breath misting in front of him, cane planted in the snow, gaze fixed on the wooden training course set up across the yard. His limp had improved, no longer a crutch, but a memory stitched into his stride. His hair was shorter now, streaked lightly with silver above the ears. And though his jaw still bore the chisel of combat, his eyes had changed. Softer, but not weak. Watchful, but not haunted. At his side, Echo moved slower these days. The German shepherd's once black muzzle had gone gray, the tan along his ribs dulled like sun-faded parchment. He walked with a slight favor to his front left leg, a gift from the blast that almost took them both, but his posture remained proud. Even at nearly 10 years old, Echo still tracked every movement with that same laser focus, as if he were waiting for one more call, one more mission. The field belonged to them now. It had been almost 18 months since they left San Diego. Discharged with honors, decorated with medals neither of them wanted but couldn't refuse, Jack and Echo had quietly disappeared into the quiet of Colorado. But their story had refused to stay quiet. The article in Stars and Stripes had gone national. The Dog Who Wouldn't Leave. The headline read like a fable, and maybe it was. Interviews followed, offers for book deals, TV appearances. Jack turned most of it down, except one idea stuck. What if they built something lasting not for the spotlight, but for others like them? That's how Pine Haven Recovery and K-9 Center began. Jack and Liz bought an old ranch on the outskirts of town, renovated the barn into kennels and classrooms, converted the stable into a therapy lodge, and opened their doors to veterans and children alike. It started with just 2 dogs, Echo and a younger golden retriever named Scout, who had flunked out of bomb detection school for being too friendly. But it wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. One of the first kids they worked with was a boy named Marcus, a pale, quiet 8-year-old with jet black hair and olive-toned skin. He refused to speak after a house fire had taken his parents the year before. His Aunt Clara had brought him to Pine Haven on a desperate whim. Clara, a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s with wide hips, thick glasses, and permanent worry carved into her forehead, didn't expect miracles. Just silence without screaming. On the second visit, Marcus sat beside Echo. He didn't speak, he didn't cry, He just placed one hand on Echo's back. The dog didn't move. By the 5th session, Marcus whispered, "He's warm." By the 10th, he was brushing Echo's fur. Jack watched it unfold from the porch some mornings, steaming mug in hand, cane resting on the rail. These were victories without medals, the ones that lasted. He kept the center small, intentionally. 5 veterans, 6 kids, a waiting list 2 counties long. Echo, despite age and soreness, still accompanied Jack every day. He wore a custom vest that read, "Therapy Dog, Retired Combat Unit." The townsfolk had come to recognize them, Jack and Echo, the quiet pair who always showed up, no matter the storm. They were invited to the local Veterans Day assembly at the high school. Jack declined the speech, but he let Echo walk with him onto the gym floor. The crowd stood in silence as they crossed to center court. When the applause came, it was quiet at first. Then it built like a wave made of gratitude. Some students cried. One teacher knelt to pet Echo. Later that week, Liz brought in a box of letters. "These are from the kids," she said, "and from some of the parents." Jack read them slowly, voice low, sometimes pausing to scratch Echo's ears. One read, "I didn't think I could trust again. But your dog did, so I tried." Another, "I don't know what war you went through, but I know mine. And thanks to Echo, it's quieter now." In the evenings, Jack and Echo would walk the perimeter of the property. The path curved behind the pine grove, across a shallow stream, and ended at a small stone circle where Jack had planted 3 wooden posts, each with the name of a fallen SWAT teammate. Echo would stop there every time, sitting still as a statue. "You remember them too, don't you?" Jack would whisper. The wind always answered. Time moved on, as it does. Echo grew slower. His naps lasted longer. He barked less, but when he did, it still had weight. One frosted morning, Jack found Echo on the porch, staring at the mountains. "You want to go today?" he asked gently. Echo stood. They went. That day, a new veteran arrived, Sergeant Olivia Hayes. Early 30s, caramel skin, hair in tight cornrows, a prosthetic arm, and a gaze that could pierce glass. She didn't speak much, but she knelt by Echo without hesitation. He leaned into her. Jack smiled. "He knows," he said. "He always knows." That night, Jack sat by the fire. Echo slept beside him, breathing slow, steady. The national press reached out again. This time, Jack said yes. The article published the following month. The headline read, "The Dog Who Wouldn't Leave and the Lives He Refused to Let Go." It ended with a photo. Jack, cane in hand. Echo, older, muzzle white. Behind them, the field. The future. Sometimes miracles don't come in the form of thunder or light. Sometimes they come with 4 paws, graying fur, and a heart that refuses to give up, even when the world already has. Echo didn't just dig through rubble, he dug through despair. Jack didn't just survive, he rose from the ashes with purpose. And maybe, just maybe, that's what grace looks like in our world today. Not loud, not perfect, but faithful, steadfast, quietly saving lives, one heartbeat at a time. So if you believe that loyalty is sacred, that healing takes more than medicine, and that God still sends help in forms we don't always expect, then share this story. Comment where you're watching from, or who you're praying for tonight. And don't forget to subscribe, because these stories aren't just entertainment, they're reminders. That broken doesn't mean finished, that the faithful are never truly lost, and that somewhere out there, a quiet miracle may already be walking toward someone who needs it most. May God bless you, protect those you love, and never let you forget. Some bonds are written not in blood, but in belief.
He was just a dog, lying by the pool like always, until he stood up and started barking like his life depended on it. His fur bristled, his eyes locked on something behind the fence. 30 seconds later, the father was sprinting across the yard and caught the neighbor mid-pour, a bottle of toxic cleaner already tilting toward the water where his daughter had just swum. If Scout hadn't barked when he did, they might not be alive to tell this story. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you believe dogs are more than pets, they're protectors, smash that like button and let's dive in. The sky over Maple Ridge looked like a slab of silver granite, the kind of overcast that pressed on the shoulders and made the wind feel colder than it should have been. It was late spring in northern Oregon, but the chill still clung to the fir trees lining the cul-de-sac, casting their towering shadows across perfect sidewalks and newly swept driveways. The neighborhood was a showcase of the tidy hedges, two-car garages, and color-coordinated mailboxes, so uniformly clean and quiet, it almost felt like a movie set. But beneath that postcard perfection, there lingered a tension so subtle it could only be sensed, not spoken. Richard Bennett tightened his grip on the cardboard box as he stepped onto the porch of the two-story house at 423 Maple Glen Drive. At 42, Richard looked like a man who had done hard work and lived through harder losses. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the calloused hands of a former contractor, his skin weathered from years of sun and sawdust. His light brown hair, clipped short, had started to turn silver near the temples, and a few days' worth of stubble clung to his strong jawline. His eyes, a cool steel blue, revealed little except to those who looked long enough to see the grief still hiding behind them. After his wife had passed away from cancer 2 years ago, Richard had decided it was time for a new beginning. He'd sold their home in Bend, left his work behind, and poured his savings into this house for his daughter's sake more than his own. Ellie Bennett, 9 years old and bursting with curiosity, ran barefoot across the grass, chasing the wind and pointing out shapes in the clouds. Her hair, long and naturally blonde, was pulled into 2 messy braids that bounced against her shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the breeze, and her overalls already had 2 new grass stains. Ellie had the kind of sharp, observant mind that made adults pause. She noticed everything, from the exact number of steps between the truck and the front door, to how her father always smiled with only one side of his mouth. She missed her mother in quiet moments, but she carried her memory in drawings, songs, and the way she whispered to the stars at night. Beside her trotted Scout, their 6-year-old German shepherd, his thick black and tan coat shining despite the overcast sky. With his tall frame, sharp ears, and intense amber eyes, Scout looked every bit the former K-9 trainee he had once been. He had been pulled from the police program after a ligament injury in his right foreleg, but his instincts remained razor sharp. He moved with silent confidence, scanning the neighborhood with disciplined calm, his steps synchronized with Ellie's pace. If she wandered too far, he herded her gently back with a nudge of his nose. To strangers, he was imposing. To Ellie, he was a big furry guardian with a heart full of loyalty. The moving truck backed out of the driveway as Richard set down the final box. A silver sedan rolled past slowly, driven by a woman in her 60s with curly white hair and pearl earrings. She smiled and gave a small wave. That was Mrs. Langston, the neighborhood matriarch and a retired schoolteacher, known for her fiercely competitive rose garden. A moment later, Todd and Jennifer Myers emerged from across the street. Todd was in his early 40s, wearing a Seahawks cap and cargo shorts, with the easy gait of someone who jogged daily but never bragged about it. Jennifer, always a bit overdressed for the weather, wore a lavender scarf despite the cold and smiled with practiced warmth. They introduced themselves quickly and offered help setting up utilities, mentioned their teenage son Mason, and dropped hints about the annual block barbecue in July. For the most part, the neighbors seemed eager to make the Bennetts feel welcome, but not all of them. At the very end of the street stood a weathered one-story home with dark shutters and ivy creeping up one side. The lawn was precise, too precise, like it had been measured with a ruler. In the front window stood a man. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, he simply watched. Gregory Wills was a 55-year-old man with a posture so stiff it looked painful. Tall and thin, with a hollow-cheeked face and a graying beard trimmed to military sharpness, Gregory looked like someone carved from cold stone. His pale green eyes were piercing and always half-lidded, giving him an air of constant judgment. He had lived alone for the past decade following a messy divorce, and while he rarely left town, his presence was always felt. Gregory was the kind of neighbor who filed formal complaints about wind chimes being too loud and Halloween decorations being excessive. And the kids in the neighborhood referred to him as Mr. Whispers because he always seemed to be just out of sight, muttering under his breath. He had a long-standing grudge against dogs, children, and pretty much anything that involved laughter. Scout noticed him immediately, As Ellie darted along the property line chasing a monarch butterfly, Scout halted, his body stiffening. His ears stood tall, his nose twitched, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Richard followed his gaze and spotted Gregory in the window, their eyes locked. Gregory didn't move, he just stared. Then, as if satisfied, he slowly backed into the shadows and let the curtain fall. Richard narrowed his eyes. "Friendly bunch, mostly," he muttered under his breath, resting a hand on Scout's head. That night, after dinner, Ellie curled up on the couch with a picture book, while Scout lay at her feet. Richard stood by the patio door, sipping coffee and looking out at the pool. It was nothing fancy, a rectangular space bordered by slate tiles and a few string lights he'd already begun to hang. But it was theirs. After years of pain, hospitals, and loss, the backyard represented peace. He wanted Ellie to feel safe here, to laugh without worry, to swim under the stars. It was a simple dream, but it meant everything. Scout rose suddenly, ears forward, body alert. Richard tensed. "What is it, boy?" Scout padded toward the sliding glass door, staring into the yard. Nothing, no movement, no sound, but Scout didn't budge. Richard slid the door open and stepped out onto the patio. The wind rustled the branches overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a screen door slammed, but the yard was still, too still. He waited another minute, then returned inside. "Just nerves," he told himself, rubbing Scout's back. But the dog's eyes remained fixed on the far end of the fence, where the shadows clung longer than they should. By the time July swept over Maple Ridge, the once crisp mornings had melted into waves of afternoon heat. The sun beat down on the asphalt like a forge, and the local squirrels took refuge under trimmed hedges and shaded porches. Birds moved sluggishly in the trees, and the sprinklers hissed like whispers across the pristine lawns. Oregon's fleeting summer had arrived with full force, and with it came the smell of freshly cut grass, chlorine, and barbecue smoke drifting lazily between the houses. In the Bennett backyard, the transformation was finally complete. The old pool tiles had been scrubbed and resealed, a new filtration system hummed quietly beneath a covered panel, and Richard had even repainted the deck's railing to a soft slate gray that matched the patio furniture. It had taken 2 solid weekends of labor under the sun, but for Richard, the effort was worth every aching muscle. The space now felt inviting, a sanctuary built with calloused hands and quiet determination. Ellie was the first to christen the newly restored pool. She dove in with the grace of a flying squirrel, sending water splashing in all directions as her joyful shrieks rang out across the yard. Her wet blonde braids stuck to her cheeks, and her green swimsuit glittered under the sunlight. The 9-year-old moved like the water was part of her, twisting and flipping with the raw energy only children seem to possess. This afternoon, she was joined by her 2 closest friends in the neighborhood, Harper and Lily. Harper was a redhead with a mass of frizzy curls tied up in a chaotic bun, pale skin peppered with freckles, and a small scrape on her elbow from a recent tree-climbing expedition. She was bold, talkative, and utterly fearless. Her mother, who owned the local bakery, had described her as a hurricane in a tutu. Lily, on the other hand, was quieter, with straight light brown hair, olive-toned skin, and almond-shaped eyes that always seemed to be watching. She was small for her age, often lost in thought, and more likely to be found with a book than a beach ball. Today she sat at the pool's edge, dipping her toes into the water, while balancing a copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins on her knees. Richard sat a few feet away, sprawled on a lounge chair, with a folded towel behind his neck and a large glass of iced tea in his hand. Despite the fact he was shirtless and his skin had browned from days in the sun, there remained a hint of heaviness in his expression, a shadow behind the eyes that lingered, a weight he bore silently. He smiled often, especially when Ellie laughed, but only someone who had seen grief firsthand would recognize the quiet restraint behind that smile. He watched the girls play with a mix of protectiveness and distant sorrow, but he found comfort in the fact that their laughter filled the air again. Near the fence, as always, Scout lay in the shade with his head raised and ears slightly tilted. The 6-year-old German shepherd was alert but composed, his muscular frame relaxed but ready, eyes scanning the yard with quiet vigilance. His black and tan coat glistened in the heat, and the slight scar along his front right leg, evidence of a training accident from his canine days, stood out faintly beneath the fur. Scout had grown even more watchful since the pool reopened. At first, Richard assumed it was just the excitement of having new scents and kids running about, but it soon became clear this was something deeper. Scout wasn't distracted. He was fixated. The dog's attention constantly returned to one spot, the far corner of the yard, where the fence separated their property from that of Gregory Wills. Gregory had barely been seen in recent weeks. A tall, bony man of 55 with angular features and a complexion that suggested he rarely left his air-conditioned home, Wills was known to the rest of the neighborhood as someone to be tolerated but not befriended. His silvery gray hair was always combed back with military precision, and his pale green eyes had the kind of coldness that seemed capable of disapproving from across a room. He wore beige trousers and collared shirts no matter the temperature, and he moved with the stiff formality of a man permanently out of step with joy. Nobody knew much about him, just that he'd lived there for nearly a decade alone, and had a habit of leaving typed complaints in neighbors' mailboxes about things like excessive laughter or dogs left unattended. Scout had taken a disliking to him immediately. That afternoon, as Harper launched herself off the diving board again, Scout stood abruptly and stared toward the fence. His ears pointed forward like radar dishes, and a low, barely audible growl vibrated from his throat. Ellie paused mid-game, floating on a pink inflatable ring, and called out, "Scout, what is it, boy?" But the dog didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed, tail lowered, body rigid. Richard set down his tea and rose from his chair. He walked over, following Scout's eyes. The fence looked normal, no movement, no sound. On the other side, Wills's backyard was perfectly manicured, almost eerily so. The grass was trimmed to a precise inch, and a collection of ceramic gnomes lined the flower bed like sentinels. Near the back corner stood a shed, its door closed, a small padlock gleaming on its latch. "Easy," Richard murmured, resting a hand on Scout's head. The dog didn't flinch, but he slowly sat down, still watching. That night, after the girls had gone home and Ellie was upstairs finishing her drawing of a mermaid riding a seahorse, Richard returned to the patio with a mug of decaf and an unread newspaper. The heat had finally eased, and the breeze carried with it the earthy scent of pine. The pool lights shimmered softly against the water. All was calm until Scout moved again. The dog, who had been resting near the sliding door, sprang up and bolted toward the back gate. He barked, loud and fierce, the sound ricocheting off the fences like a siren. Richard jumped to his feet, nearly spilling his coffee, and followed. "Scout!" he shouted. The dog stood at the gate, snarling now, his nose pressed to the wood. Richard froze. Then he heard it, the faintest scuffle, a rustle. Something or someone was moving on the other side. He flicked on the patio light and grabbed the flashlight from the grill cart. Stepping cautiously, he shone the beam through the fence slats. For a moment, nothing. Then a shadow slipped past the shed, a silhouette retreating quickly into darkness. Not an animal, a person. The motion-activated light on Gregory's back porch blinked on. There was a pause, then a door slammed shut. Scout growled one last time before slowly retreating to Richard's side. The yard grew still again, but the silence felt different now, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Something had been there, and Scout had seen it first. The heat hadn't broken. If anything, it had intensified. By early evening, Maple Ridge simmered under a fading orange sky, the humidity clinging to windows like a second layer of glass. The occasional breeze offered no relief, just stirred the heat like a spoon in thick soup. Richard stood on the back patio with a cordless drill in one hand and a new security camera in the other, sweat dripping from his temple into the collar of his t-shirt. He wiped his brow and glanced at Scout, who sat dutifully nearby, eyes trained on the corner of the fence that had become his obsession. Scout had grown more agitated over the last week, especially after the shadow behind Wills's shed. No longer was he just growling, he was actively patrolling the backyard, stopping only to drink water or nudge Ellie inside when dusk fell. Richard had initially dismissed the behavior as residual canine instinct, but something about the dog's focus unsettled him. Scout wasn't acting out of habit. He was acting with purpose. Richard had seen enough in his past life as a contractor working late jobs in rough neighborhoods to know when something was off. After that shadowy movement the other night, he decided it was time to take action. The next day, he'd driven down to the local hardware store, an aging brick building run by a couple in their 70s named Sam and Lorraine McConnell. Sam was tall and rail-thin, with weathered skin like cracked leather and a perpetual squint from decades working under sun and sawdust. Lorraine, shorter and plumper, wore oversized glasses and moved with surprising speed, always armed with a tape measure or a label maker. They recommended a reliable set of motion-activated night vision cameras with cloud backup, And by the time Richard got home, he was already mentally placing them around the yard. Now, with the final camera mounted under the eaves of the back deck, Richard stepped down and gave the area a once-over. 3 cameras covered the fence line, one aimed directly at the pool and another at the gate. He opened the app on his phone and nodded in approval as the feeds flickered to life. Scout circled once near the base of the steps and lay down with a low huff, tail twitching. "You'll catch him if he comes back," Richard muttered, patting the dog's head. "But now we've got backup." That night, the air was heavy with silence. Even the crickets seemed subdued. Ellie was asleep upstairs, sprawled across her bed with arms thrown wide and a plush dolphin tucked under her chin. Richard sat in the living room, phone in hand, the camera feeds open in a grid. He sipped coffee despite the heat, gaze locked on the dim images of his yard. Around midnight, Scout lifted his head. His ears twitched. Then he stood. Richard froze, then glanced at the feed from the rear gate. Movement. A shape emerged from the shadows, tall and cautious. The camera's night vision caught the figure in stark grayscale, someone in long pants and a loose shirt, face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low. The figure crouched near the fence, then produced a large canister gray industrial-looking. The cap came off briefly, revealing short-cropped hair and a sunken face. Richard's heart slammed in his chest. It was Gregory Wills. Scout exploded into a fury of barking, rushing to the glass door and pawing at it frantically. The figure flinched, dropped in the canister, and bolted. The camera caught him stumbling over a decorative stone, then vaulting the far end of the fence like a man half his age. Richard sprang from the couch and flung the door open, but by the time he reached the gate, Wills was gone. Scout sniffed the ground aggressively, tail high, muscles taut. The canister still lay on the grass. Richard picked it up with a towel. It was a commercial pool chemical container, unlabeled, dented, and reeking of something caustic. Not just pool cleaner, something stronger. Back inside, Richard reviewed the footage twice, 3 times. There was no doubt. The way the man moved, the shape of his jaw, the tilt of his head, it was Wills. The scout, now calmed, lay on the rug, but didn't take his eyes off the door. The next morning, Richard made a copy of the footage and saved it to 3 different devices. He called the non-emergency police line and requested an officer for a trespassing report. He didn't mention the chemical, not yet. By noon, a cruiser pulled up outside the house. Officer Dana Riley stepped out. She was in her early 30s, tall and lean, with dark blonde hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp hazel eyes that scanned constantly. Her uniform was neat, her belt perfectly arranged, and her walk brisk but not aggressive. She greeted Richard with professional courtesy and took notes as he described the events. Riley reviewed the footage on his phone, her jaw tightened. "That's definitely grounds for a formal report. You're sure that's your neighbor?" "It's him," Richard said, arms crossed. "Scout knew it before I did." She gave a short nod. "I'll file this. You did the right thing installing cameras. If anything else happens, call us immediately." Richard thanked her, and as she left, she paused at the gate and looked down at Scout. "Good boy," she murmured. Scout wagged his tail once. The sun burned hotter that afternoon, but it did little to thaw the chill that settled in Richard's bones. By the time the calendar turned to August, the relentless Oregon sun showed no signs of relenting. The lawns of Maple Ridge began to yellow at the edges, despite the best efforts of sprinkler systems, and the sky, once wide and brilliant, seemed faded, bleached by the constant heat. The air was dry, humming faintly with the whir of cicadas. Even the usual rustle of leaves felt sluggish, weighed down by late summer fatigue. But in the Bennett household, sleep was a rarer commodity than rainfall. It was just past 2 a.m. when Scout began growling again. Not the curious low grumble of a dog dreaming, but a sharp, guttural warning that brought Richard out of bed in an instant. He found Scout at the foot of the stairs, body rigid, amber eyes fixed on the sliding glass door at the rear of the house. Without hesitation, the dog darted forward and began scratching insistently at the base of the door, then turned and barked, a crisp, urgent sound meant for one person alone. Richard hurried downstairs, his heart thudding. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and flicked it on as he slid the door open. Scout bounded out into the night like a bolt, nose low to the ground. The air outside was still, the yard bathed in pale silver light from the motion sensors. Richard followed quickly, scanning the perimeter. The gate was unlatched. Scout was already at the far end of the yard, growling again. He stood at attention near the flower beds, tail bristling, nose aimed at the shadows. Then Richard saw it. the shape of a man retreating fast over the back fence. This time, there was no need to guess. By dawn, Richard had compiled the second set of footage, clearer than the last. The man's face was angled toward the pool lights, just enough to erase all doubt. The container in his hand was the same one he'd dropped a week earlier, but this time, it had a new label, partially torn, reading caustic sodium hypochlorite. He called the police again. But this time, it wasn't Officer Riley who arrived. Detective Blake Morgan stepped out of the cruiser. In his late 40s, Morgan was a broad-shouldered man with a sun-worn face and short salt-and-pepper hair. His deep-set eyes were calm but piercing, the kind that suggested he'd seen more than he had ever talked about. His navy shirt sleeves were rolled neatly to the elbows, revealing forearms that looked carved from corded rope. He approached the house with the measured stride of someone who didn't waste motion. Richard met him at the porch, Scout standing close by. "You're the homeowner?" Morgan asked, his voice deep and even. "Richard Bennett, this is Scout." Morgan gave a quick nod to the dog, then motioned toward the door. "Let's take a look." Inside, Richard pulled up the footage on the living room TV. As the second break-in played out on screen, Morgan stood silent, arms crossed, his eyes narrowing at the clear image of Gregory Wills climbing the fence with the canister. "He tried it twice?" Morgan asked. "Yes. First time Scout stopped him before he could do anything. This time he nearly made it to the water." Morgan exhaled slowly through his nose. "You're lucky that dog's trained." "He's more than trained," Richard said. "He's family." Morgan looked down at Scout. "He ever worked K9? Started training but got pulled out after a tendon injury. Still has the instincts." "Clearly." Morgan asked to see the container. Richard retrieved it from a locked cabinet. The detective opened the lid cautiously and sniffed, then recoiled slightly. "Yeah, that's industrial-grade bleach. This could seriously harm a child. Skin burns, eye damage. Ingesting even trace amounts could put a kid in the hospital." Richard clenched his jaw. "My daughter swims in that pool." "Then it's a miracle nothing happened." Morgan took photos, made a report, and advised Richard not to confront Wills directly. "Let us handle it. He's crossed into criminal territory. Document everything, and keep the dog close." Richard nodded. That night, when Ellie came downstairs asking why there were police cars outside again, he wrapped his arms around her tightly and simply said, "Scout saved us, again." The morning sun hung low and white in the hazy sky, casting long shadows across Maple Ridge, as if the town itself was reluctant to wake. The humidity had lifted overnight, replaced by a dry, brittle stillness that settled over lawns, fences, and rooftops. Maple leaves clung motionless to their branches, and the only sound was the soft creak of a breeze pushing through a loose shutter. But inside the Bennett home, the air was heavier than ever. Richard stood at the kitchen counter, staring down into his untouched cup of coffee. His stubble was thicker than usual, eyes rimmed with fatigue, but there was a sharpness in his posture, a tension curled into his shoulders. He wasn't exhausted from lack of sleep, he was bracing for what would come next. Ellie, sensing the unrest in the house, had left early with a neighbor friend for a pancake breakfast on Main Street. That left just Richard and Scout, who sat by the back door as if guarding the threshold to something sacred. Shortly after 9, the unmarked police car rolled to a stop outside. Detective Blake Morgan stepped out. Same crisp navy shirt rolled at the sleeves, dark jeans and boots, coated lightly in roadside dust. The man's presence carried the weight of finality. Behind him emerged a second-figure officer, Gina Harrell, a woman in her early 40s with a lean build and deeply tanned skin. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail, and her mirrored sunglasses obscured her expression. But her walk was efficient, precise. She had a reputation in the department for being direct and never wasting a word. Morgan greeted Richard with a nod. "He's agreed to speak." "Here?" Richard asked, surprised. "In the cruiser. We'll keep it formal," Morgan replied. "He won't set foot on your property again. That I promise." The door of the back seat opened with a mechanical click, and Gregory Wills stepped out, flanked by Harrell. The man looked smaller than before. His once crisp white button-down was wrinkled at the collar. His beige slacks, though ironed, hung more loosely on his bony frame. His silver hair was combed, but dampened at the edges, sweat clinging to his temples despite the mild morning air. He didn't look around. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. They led him to the folding chair set up near the gate, just within view of the backyard. Richard remained by the porch, arms crossed, Scout sitting beside him like a silent statue, alert but still. The air between them stretched taut like a thread on the verge of snapping. Morgan began the questioning calmly. "Mr. Wills, you've seen the footage. You were caught trespassing on Mr. Bennett's property twice once with intent to tamper with the pool using caustic chemicals. Do you understand the severity of these actions?" Wills remained silent. His pale green eyes were slightly red at the edges, the only hint of emotion on an otherwise cold face. He opened his mouth once, closed it again, then finally spoke. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said, his voice raspier than before, but it was getting to be too much. Morgan narrowed his eyes. What was? "The noise," Wills muttered. "The screaming, the barking, the splashing. Every damn afternoon like a carnival in my backyard. I didn't sign up for this when I bought the house." Richard stepped forward slightly, but said nothing. Scout stood up too, as if sensing the change in his owner's breath. Wills looked down at his hands. "I've had insomnia for 7 years. After my wife left, I couldn't sleep through the night without medication. It was finally getting better. Then the kid moved in. Then the dog. It started again, the barking, the kids yelling. I tried earplugs, white noise, everything. Nothing worked." Morgan remained still. "So, you brought a container of industrial bleach onto someone else's property." Wills flinched, voice rising. "It wasn't supposed to go in the water. I wanted to scare them. Maybe burn the grass a little, ruin the filter. Something. I don't know. I wasn't thinking straight." Harold spoke for the first time. "You brought poison. You climbed the fence. That's intent, Mr. Wills." There was silence. Then Wills turned his head, slowly, toward Scout. "That dog," he said, eyes narrowing slightly. "He stopped me both times. Never seen anything like it. Stood between me and the pool like a damn soldier." Scout didn't blink. Wills looked back down and let out a low breath. "He's smarter than me, isn't he?" No one answered. Morgan turned to Harold. "Let's finish the paperwork." They walked him back to the car. This time Wills didn't resist. He ducked into the back seat without a word. The door closed with a click that sounded strangely final. Richard watched them drive away until the taillights disappeared behind a row of elms. He knelt beside Scout, resting a hand on the dog's shoulder. "You did it, buddy." Scout licked his palm once, then resumed his quiet watch beside the porch. By late August, the air in Maple Ridge had shifted. The stifling heat of midsummer gave way to a drier, gentler warmth that whispered of fall. The leaves at the tips of the trees began to bronze ever so slightly, and the sidewalks, once empty during the peak of heat, began to fill again with neighbors strolling in the evenings. Lawn mowers went quiet, replaced by the occasional laughter of children and the distant clang of backyard wind chimes. The town seemed to exhale after weeks of holding its breath. And the Bennett backyard, once marked by tension and surveillance, became the heart of something unexpected celebration. The Bennett pool sparkled under a string of paper lanterns that fluttered in the mild breeze. The scent of grilled hot dogs, sunscreen, and fresh-cut watermelon mingled in the air. Colorful streamers were tied between the porch posts, and Ellie had set up a makeshift craft table near the garden, complete with crayons, stickers, and sidewalk chalk for the younger kids. Laughter rang across the yard, and the neighborhood had shown up in full force. There were lawn chairs arranged in a crescent shape near the pool, coolers tucked under tables, and plates balanced on knees. But in the center of it all, wearing a red bandana with a silver bone-shaped tag, was Scout. The 6-year-old German Shepherd was seated regally on a thick quilt spread beneath the maple tree, his posture relaxed but alert, as if he still couldn't quite turn off his guard dog instincts. His black and tan coat was freshly brushed, his ears perked every time someone called his name, and his tail thumped gently against the grass as guests passed by and reached out to scratch his head. His eyes, intelligent and calm, scanned the scene with quiet approval. Ellie ran up to him with a drawing in her hand. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress and sparkly sandals, her blonde hair tied back with a ribbon. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement. "Scout, look!" she said, holding up the picture with both hands. It was a crayon drawing of Scout in front of a house, a smiling sun above, and the words in crooked block letters, "Thank you for saving us." Richard crouched down beside her, a proud smile stretching across his face. He looked more rested than he had in weeks. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders since the move seemed to have eased. Today he was just a father watching his daughter beam with joy. The crowd parted as a familiar figure approached. Detective Blake Morgan, now dressed casually in khaki slacks and a short-sleeved gray shirt, stepped forward with something in his hand. His sleeves weren't rolled this time, and a dark brown leather belt with a silver badge clipped to his waistband was the only sign of his position. His expression was softer than usual, and his weathered face showed lines of respect rather than command. Behind him walked an older man with a warm, weathered face and a kind glint in his eyes. Chief Harold Dunley, Maple Ridge's long-serving police chief, was in his 60s with a sturdy build and a neatly trimmed white beard. He wore a navy polo with the department's insignia embroidered over the chest and a ball cap that shaded his crow's feet. He stopped in front of Scout and gave a small nod. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dunley said, voice loud enough to quiet the chatter, "we're here today not just for barbecue and lemonade, but to recognize a member of our community who went above and beyond the call of instinct." A few kids giggled. Someone clapped softly. "This hero didn't carry a badge," the chief continued, "but he did what many wouldn't. He stood guard, protected his family, and helped us stop something that could have ended very badly. And for that, we say thank you." He stepped aside as Detective Morgan lifted a small black velvet box. Inside was a gleaming silver medallion on a red ribbon, etched with the words "Canine Hero, Maple Ridge PD." Morgan knelt beside Scout, who tilted his head curiously. "You earned this, buddy," he said quietly, slipping the ribbon over the dog's neck. "You kept watch when others didn't know they had to. And now, well, now you're officially one of us." The yard erupted in applause. Ellie threw her arms around Scout's neck and whispered something into his ear that no one else could hear. He licked her cheek gently in return. From the porch, Mrs. Langston, the retired teacher with the award-winning rose garden, wiped a tear from her cheek. "About time someone threw a party for the right kind of neighbor," she murmured. Todd and Jennifer from across the street passed out extra slices of watermelon. Even Mason, their lanky teenage son who usually hid behind headphones, came forward and gave Scout a respectful salute. That night, as the last of the guests trickled home and the lanterns swayed gently in the dusk, Richard stood at the edge of the pool. He looked out over the yard, the chalk drawings on the pavement, the empty lemonade cups, the handmade sign reading, "Thank you, Scout," taped to the fence, and felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Scout padded up beside him and sat quietly. "You know," Richard said softly, staring at the moon's reflection in the water, "this place didn't feel like home until today." Scout didn't respond, of course, but his tail brushed against Richard's leg twice, steady and warm. The next summer in Maple Ridge arrived gentler than the last. The sun no longer scorched the sidewalks, but kissed them with mellow warmth. The skies were clearer, the breeze softer. Birds gathered in clusters on telephone wires, and squirrels darted across fences with joyful urgency. It wasn't just the weather that had changed. It was the feel of the street itself, lighter, safer, more connected. The memory of what had happened the year before still lingered, not as a scar, but as a turning point. The old white house at the end of the lane, once cloaked in silence and suspicion, now bore fresh life. Its faded shutters had been painted a cheerful sage green, and flower boxes brimmed with marigolds and trailing ivy. The lawn, once overgrown and neglected, was freshly mowed, and wind chimes danced in the breeze from the wraparound porch. The new owners, Tom and Linda Halverson, had moved in just before spring thaw. Both in their late 60s, they were semi-retired school teachers from Eugene, Oregon, with a fondness for porch swings, folk music, and lemon bars. Tom was a tall, thin man with a full head of silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down the bridge of his nose. He wore suspenders without irony and had a soft, grandfatherly chuckle that echoed down the street whenever a child passed by. Linda, shorter and rounder, wore floral blouses and wide-brimmed hats, her gray curls always pinned back with colorful clips. She baked often, waved at every neighbor, and insisted on learning every child's name. They had brought with them a rescue beagle named Daisy, old and slow, but endlessly patient. Where once the Wills house had been avoided, now it was a regular stop on neighborhood walks. Tom built a little library box by the curb, and Linda hosted Sunday morning coffee for the ladies of the block. What had once been division was now unity, and at the center of it all was the Bennett backyard. Every Saturday afternoon, the sounds of splashing and laughter spilled out across the fence. Richard, now visibly more relaxed and often found in a Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops, had added a grill station near the pool and a few hammocks strung between the trees. He manned the tongs with the precision of a craftsman, flipping burgers for a rotating cast of hungry kids and grateful parents. Ellie, now 10, had grown an inch and a half and developed a new love for storytelling. She gathered her friends on striped towels and told Scout adventures with the flair of a camp counselor. Scout, as always, stayed close. At 7 years old, his fur had thickened slightly around the neck, and a faint sprinkle of gray had started appearing near his muzzle, but his posture remained proud, eyes alert. He was no longer just the family dog. He was a fixture of the community. Children called his name when they arrived, patted his head before diving into the pool. Even Daisy would nuzzle up beside him and rest her chin on his paw, the two dogs content in their silent companionship. That afternoon, during one of their neighborhood gatherings, a small ceremony took place. Linda Halverson stepped up with a small canvas wrapped in paper. "Ellie told me what Scout means to this place," she said warmly, "so I painted something for him and all of you." She unwrapped the canvas to reveal a watercolor portrait. It showed the pool, the maple tree, and Scout seated proudly beside it, wearing his red bandana and medal. Behind him, the faint outlines of children played in the water, while sunbeams filtered through branches above. On the bottom was scripted, in elegant cursive, "Protector, friend, symbol of trust." Applause broke out. Ellie ran forward and hugged Linda tightly, then turned to Scout and held up the painting. "Look, it's you," she whispered. Scout gave a soft bark and wagged his tail. Later, as twilight set in and fireflies began their quiet dance through the grass, Richard stood once again near the pool. This time, he wasn't alone in his reflection. Tom stood beside him, a lemonade in hand. "You know," Tom said, voice low and thoughtful, "places don't just become communities overnight. It takes someone to wake people up." Richard looked toward Scout, now lying under the tree beside Ellie. "Yeah, sometimes it just takes one good dog." They clinked their plastic cups together. By the time the last citronella candle had burned out and children had been carried home half asleep, Scout remained in his place, watching, not guarding, just watching, not because he had to, but because he still cared. And though he would never say a word, everyone in Maple Ridge knew their peace, their joy, their unity had begun with him. Sometimes God sends angels on 4 legs. Scout didn't wear a badge, he didn't speak a single word, but he knew when something was wrong, and he stood between danger and the ones he loved. Maybe that's what real miracles look like. Not thunder from the sky, but a dog who won't let you sleep through the night, because he knows he's your protector. If you've ever felt protected in ways you couldn't explain, maybe you've been blessed more than you know. Type "Amen" in the comments. If you believe God still works through the quiet ones, through loyal hearts and watchful eyes. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that even in silence, we're never truly alone. Subscribe for more true stories of faith, family, and the animals who never gave up on us. And may God bless you and your home with peace, protection, and the kind of love that never sleeps.